Hello and welcome to this special edition of Indianomics, where we have one of the most famous columnists who writes on economic policy from Britain. We have with us Martin Wolf, the chief economics commentator at Financial Times. Mr. Wolf, thank you very much indeed for joining us today, because there are so many questions surrounding Brexit for starters, and not to speak of course, a world economy that is torn apart by trade and tariff wars, as well as probably slow down in two of the largest economies in the world. But I will start at the beginning, and I will start at your doorstep, Britain itself. Explain to us, what are the next possible steps? Do we have the same Prime Minister renegotiating with EU? Do we have a different Prime Minister renegotiating with the EU? Do we have another election, or do we have another referendum?
Well, the answer to that is I don't know. I'm here in India and I feel quite detached from what's going on. But the truth is, I think nobody in London knows. There will be a vote of no confidence in Parliament, I believe, today. And almost everybody expects the Prime Minister will win. So we will not have a new Prime Minister. We will have the same Prime Minister. If that is the case, I stress if, then she will have to decide in a way what she has to do. She is required, or has been asked, to provide a new plan in 3 days. My own guess is that she will go to Brussels and ask them if they can make any changes that make a difference. I suspect she will be unable to find a set of changes in the discussions with Brussels that will begin to give her a majority. This was such a smashing defeat. So at that stage, the obvious possibilities is that she sticks with where she is, and we crash out with no deal because we don't get this through and at the end of March the 29th. But there is also a possibility in this situation that either Labour as a party or parts of the Labour Party unite with the Conservative Remainers to impose upon the government essentially the alternative, some other alternative, of which the most likely one would be agreement to another referendum. That would require us to get an extension of the withdrawal period from the Article 50 period, as it's called, from the EU. We'd probably get that, but not certainly. And then, of course, somebody would have to organise, carry through what would be a very complicated referendum, probably with 3 options. So my view at the moment is it's very likely that we will crash out without a deal. It's not very likely that she will be able to get a deal like the present one through, and there is a significant, possibly rising possibility, but still not a huge one, that we will end up with another referendum, which could mean, if the Remain side won, that we never leave the EU at all. And all this is uncertain and chaotic and completely unprecedented.
Okay. We've not seen too much of chaos in the financial markets, in spite of what is a very seminal decision for Britain. What is your sense? Do currencies continue to remain within a range, as it were? I mean, there'll be highs and lows, but nothing very, catastrophic.
Yes, there are 2 factors here. The simple truth is that Britain is not an enormously important economy. It's perhaps the 5th largest, but it is really quite a small economy. And this is essentially a crisis that concerns Britain. So if the worst comes to the worst, the pound will fall if we crash out without a deal, and British financial assets will decline. But my own view is this doesn't look like a really significant world event, and I wouldn't expect it to lead to massive financial turmoil.
Okay. Well, let me then round up this set of questions with your expectations on EU itself, with or without Britain. Do you think EU will more or less rumble along with the same kind of members and rules to the end of 2019 and maybe to the end of 2020 as well?
Oh, yes. I'm quite confident that the EU Since it's now coming out of the crisis, Britain's departure will not be significant. It will, unless something quite extraordinary happens. Nothing can be ruled out in world affairs, but I expect the EU to be around for decades, not just for a year or two. Of course, its economics are in trouble. I expect the ECB may be forced to pursue more QE. It may not like this, but I don't see any existential crisis in the EU.
Okay. No, I will come back to this theme of the crisis that appears to be faced by liberalism and globalization and elites world over. But I'll come to that at the end of the conversation. Let me come to the other big issue that the world has been grappling with for the last year or maybe even 2 years, this trade tussle between US and China. You think that it comes into an agreement before that 90-day period, or do you think that it will revisit at several points in 2019 itself?
This is another immensely unpredictable thing. And the main reason that it's unpredictable is the way the US administration works. Mr. Trump is wildly unpredictable. Nobody really knows what he wants from China. Nobody really knows whether what he wants from China is what his administration officials say they want from China. And nobody knows what this deal he made with Mr. Xi will amount to. My guess is that this 90 days period will not lead to a resolution with China. They might say they've made some progress, but many of the big issues that the Americans have insisted upon, which are really radical, will not be agreed to by China. But there is a possibility, and that's what happened with the NAFTA negotiations, that the Chinese will offer enough to Mr. Trump that he feels he can declare a victory. He knows that his supporters don't understand the details anyway. He can declare a victory, he can say we got everything we want, and in that case the dispute will be over. And this is why it's unpredictable. So the real issues will not be resolved, but maybe Mr. Trump will say it's been a triumphant success because the Chinese throw him a few bones.
Okay. So we are going to see a year of a lot of sound and fury, perhaps signifying nothing. Let me come to the real economy itself, the top two economies. Do you expect first China to slow down significantly? We got quite a shocker in terms of their latest trade data.
Yes, it does appear that China is slowing more than most people realized. I think many of us had felt for quite a long time that the Chinese economy is quite fragile, mainly because it is dependent on not because of exports, though that's not trivial, but mainly because it's so dependent on investment, and the investment rate is so unreasonably high. So I do think they might have a problem in dealing with the slowdown, and it is quite possible that the slowdown is bigger than they are yet admitting. What will they do about it? The big problem they have is the only way they know how to deal with this is to start the credit boom again, and that means getting even more debt. Now, that might solve the problem in the short run, but it will make the longer run problem they have even bigger. And that underlies the important issue, which is China faces some really big structural and reform issues now. It's faced them for some years, and it's very difficult in their experience to resolve them. And it's because of that situation that they find this immediate cyclical problem so difficult.
Okay. And what's your reading of the US economy? This year, they will have to manage without that big tax advantage that the companies had last time. The Fed seems to be coming around to the fact that maybe things will slow down. But what's your own assessment? You think rate hikes are over? You think even the balance sheet contraction is going to be slowed?
Yes, my guess is that it's quite likely that the hikes are finished or nearly finished. The underlying reality is that the US economy isn't that strong. There was an enormous boost from this completely unsustainable and, in my view, quite improper fiscal expansion. That is now passing through. Underlying growth of the economy is closer to 2% potential growth than the 3% or so that they were talking about, possibly even less than that. The growth, inflation is well under control so far. We're not seeing any problems there. And what the Fed wants to do is to get growth round to that sort of level, and that seems to me where it's going. That's not a problem. Unemployment is very, very low. Basically, we're seeing the US move from a very strong cyclical upswing to a slower long-term trend growth with what will probably continue to be very modest interest rates, because essentially the economy can't stand higher interest rates than this.
Welcome back to Indianomics. We've been speaking with Martin Wolf, the Associate Editor and Chief Economics Commentator at the Financial Times, one of the most renowned journalists when it comes to writing about economic policies. Mr. Wolf, it's just as well we got that break, because I now want to shift from the developed world to emerging markets and to India. Well, first up, your initial views on India when you heard about the central banker, Urjit Patel, suddenly resigning. Did it bring doubts about whether institutions are firm in India?
Well, it was certainly a shock. It's not a normal event. I don't think I have any clear idea of why this happened. We have no clear idea of why this happened. But we do understand very clearly that there is a lot of disagreement between the government and the Reserve Bank on quite a number of issues, on monetary policy, on financial regulation, on the so-called dividend, the special dividend, on whether the RBI has excess capital, a whole range of issues which are obviously very significant. And it's obviously people outside who don't know the details look at Mr. Patel's resignation in that context.
Okay. Have you studied the Reserve Bank's capital issue or any central bank's capital issue? Would you believe it is overcapitalized?
This is a very complex issue in economics, and economists disagree very strongly on whether central banks need a strong capital position. I noticed that Mr. Raghuram Rajan, who's a very distinguished economist and former governor of the RBI, thinks it's very important, particularly because the government of India does not have itself such a high credit rating, that the RBI have a very, very strong capital position. I have to say that personally, I'm one of those people who tends to think that the amount of capital in a central bank really doesn't matter that much. It's a branch of the government. It's not like an ordinary bank. It can't be wound up. Its liabilities are money, and it can create money freely. That's what it's for. So it's never been quite obvious to me how important it is that a central bank have a huge amount of capital of its own. And the RBI is certainly, by international standards, very highly capitalized. So actually, in this specific issue, I feel that the government of India has a reasonable case. I don't want to get involved in this in too much detail, but this is a matter of judgment. There is no very clear answer on who is right, and economists, serious economists, differ on this issue very significantly.
Okay. Well, let me come to another issue on which perhaps you're better placed. You've been observing the NDA government, the Narendra Modi government, for the past 5 years. They're about to seek to renew their work permit yet again in April, when the general elections will be called. What's your assessment? He came with a great deal of promise, and at least Indian voter placed a lot of faith. He came with a 335 out of 545 majority, well over a two-thirds majority for the first time in 26 years.
So if you were asking me what is my overall assessment, I would make it something like this. I think the Indian economy has continued to perform reasonably well, not startlingly well, very much in line with the longer-term trends. I think the government has implemented some significant reforms. The introduction of the goods and services tax is an important one. The bankruptcy code is an important one. They have made some steps, though I think too slowly, to restructure and recapitalize the banking system. I regard demonetization as an extraordinary policy for which I can see no serious justification, and I remain of that view. So I would say that, to me, as an outsider, what you see is continuity, not radical change, not radical transformation, some sensible reforms, perfectly reasonable management of the economy, except over the demonetization issue, and therefore nothing revolutionary, but on the other hand, also nothing really seriously disappointing.
Okay, well, I guess that would be the majority judgment as well. But Mr. Wolf, now let me just expand the canvas to the whole challenge that liberals have been facing, elites have been facing, and even globalization as a concept has been facing. Do you think this challenge was a reaction to the crisis and the way it was handled, and that liberalism will come back to reign, come back to win another day?
It's actually quite a complicated set of challenges. One of the things that I hadn't realized at all, but that was stupid, is that in a way a bigger challenge was going to be to democracy than to globalization. A lot of the backlash, if you like, takes an authoritarian has an authoritarian tinge.
Yes.
To the extent that it's anti-globalization, with the exception of America, where there's a very strong protectionist shift, which you don't see in the same degree elsewhere, the main sort of anti-globalization thing going on in the West is anti-migration, anti-immigration, so which was not something we were thinking of so strongly. So I would say the really striking thing has been the rise of nationalism and authoritarianism, less than the rise of anti-capitalism and anti-globalization. Okay. The big exception to that, and certainly has been the US, where it's clear that they have elected a man who, in addition to being a nationalist and having authoritarian tendencies, is quite a strong protectionist. How protectionist his administration will end up being at the end of the day is quite unclear. They will say they just want a level playing field. So when I look at this now, compared to what I expected 10 years ago, when I expected more of a backlash against capitalism and less of a backlash against democracy, it seems to me to have gone a bit in the opposite direction. Okay. And indeed, that's what I'm focusing on. I'm writing a book at the moment about the crisis of democratic capitalism, with the emphasis very much on democracy. Okay.
No, I take your point, sir. Actually, you know, we have seen, probably because of this rise of populism and a rise of, you know, larger-than-life leaders, Trump included, Erdogan, Xi, Putin, and Narendra Modi himself. Definitely there has been a rise of, you know, these larger-than-life leaders. But what's your sense? You know, just about 10 years ago, we thought there's Arab Spring and democracy's canvas will actually spread across the world. Do you think democracy wins this challenge, that this populist, larger-than-life leaders is a passing phase?
Well, it's a very interesting phenomenon. You've captured it perfectly. What has happened, what you call larger-than-life, or we call strong men leaders, have, and I think they've all been men, have emerged in many important countries over the last 20 years, but increasing the last 10 years. And in fact, most of the major countries of the world are now run by people like that. They are elected, so you continue to have an electoral process. They tend to be rather hostile to established institutions, rather hostile to, and this varies across countries, of course, they're all different, but somewhat hostile to free press, to which they call fake news, to the rule of law, legal institutions. So what you can have is, if you like, we sometimes call it plebiscitary dictatorship. Okay. Dictatorship is too strong a word. An elected leader who is the focus of sovereign power and who is elected, but to some extent rides roughshod over what we thought of as liberal democracy. Now that seems to me a subtler way of thinking about what's going on. It can still be democracy, but the question is this democracy compatible fully with the sort of liberties, freedom under the law, and so forth that we thought was associated with it? Now, I don't want to be simplistic about it, but looking at the world now, looking at the major states of the world, that seems to be what is emerging. Where that will go in the end, will democracy become a shell? Will the elections be real? That's a big question.
So you just leave it as a question in your book, or do you think you can find an answer that this is a phase and institutions, rule of law, civil liberties will come back?
Yeah, well, I hope very much there will be a solution, and I will recommend political and policy changes that recognize the anxieties and fears of ordinary people, completely legitimate anxieties and fears and hopes, which have encouraged them to trust in strongmen leaders. I tend to the view that these hopes that are vested in these strong men are usually confounded. They don't turn out to be genuine, that these leaders usually offer false promises, not genuine solutions, and therefore this is not the right way to go. But of course that means that liberal Democrats need to come forward with effective policies that deal with the anxieties and fears of ordinary people in a time of very radical economic and technological upheaval. This is very difficult. I can't summarize it in a minute or so, but that is clearly the challenge for those like me who believe in liberal forms of democracy.
Yes, you've given us a peep into your thinking, and we will look forward to your book with interest, The Crisis of Democratic Capitalism. Thank you very much, Martin Wolf, for spending time with us at CNBC TV 18.